Welcome. And we are super excited for our presentation today. My name is Eric Handler. For those that I've not had the opportunity to meet, I'm the managing partner here at Handler. And I'm going to be your presenter today. And it's brought to you by the great folks on our team. Specifically, I'd like to thank Jack Lloyd for the incredible research that he's done just over the last couple of days to gather all the data and the information to formulate our thinking on this topic, as well as Nadine Wally, who is going to be handling our chat stream. So if you've got comments, we would really encourage you to participate in that manner. If you've got questions, please ask your questions. We will follow up and provide some specific answers. If we don't know the answers, then we'll find some smart people that do. For those of you that don't know us, Handler is a 43-year-old executive search firm. We're located here in Atlanta. We've executed over 3,000 executive searches successfully. So we've been around a while. And we've seen a lot, and we've experienced the ups and downs of the recessions. And I think I'm with you in that none of us have ever quite seen what we're seeing now. We've got some great content that I'm really honored to share with you today based on some very recent research, and really appreciate you being here, specifically in regards to really the questions and the comments that you made in the registration. Those were helpful in getting us an understanding of the information that you were looking for. And in fact, we really structured this presentation based on your needs. So let's go ahead and get started as it relates to the last 45 days. Holy mackerel, these have been really interesting times to participate in these events really surrounding COVID. And we have all felt the effects. My thoughts and my heart goes out to all of you that perhaps may have been affected personally or have had friends or family that have been affected personally. One way or another, this has all absolutely affected us. Yet we think that the topic that we're going to talk about today is especially relevant, especially considering all of us that are located here in Georgia. For those of you that probably know, our governor announced just a couple of weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, that the state is reopening up again. And frankly, it took us all a little bit by surprise. Perhaps it took you by surprise as well. What was interesting, though, is that it immediately began to shift our mindset. And it reminded me of thinking about when the whole thing started in the beginning of March, where we had so many questions, so many thoughts. Now with the reopening, we have a whole new set of questions and thoughts. And so for today, we're going to really focus on three primary areas as it relates to the reopening. We're going to talk about some lessons learned as an organization. We're going to discuss the fact that this is really a crisis in motion. And based on our research, we've identified some roadblocks that we all kind of have to consider as it relates to that reopening. And then we can't deny the fact that we're in the search industry, and we're going to talk about some hiring trends that we're already starting to see that are impacting the hiring landscape and the business. So let's go ahead and get started with the first lesson learned. I don't know if you have seen this picture yet, but there have been a lot of words that I've learned and that I've repeated quite a bit over the last 45 days. But this picture is actually taken just 2 weeks ago, believe it or not. I won't name the company, but it defined a word that has been very important and a lesson that we continually learn. And this is not an example that we want you to follow, but the word is tone deaf. And unfortunately for this company, they really didn't pay attention to the ramifications. They unfortunately received a lot of negative publicity. But along with these words, we've learned shelter in place, social distancing, pivot is one that we'll probably use in the next 20 minutes, if you will. And so this was really an interesting point that was brought. There were 3 lessons that I would like to share that we've learned as an organization that I've really thought a lot about as a leader. And the first is the power of simplicity and focus. You know, the first 2 weeks of COVID were quite crazy. In fact, I remember my schedule at that time. I was just planning the first day, the third day, and the 5th day in terms of my to-do list. Any calendaring went out the window. And I had to really kind of say, how am I finding focus? And so this idea of focus and simplicity was really important to me. In fact, you know, I think about in the chaos, the question that we want to be asking ourselves is, how are we focusing on the critical few? It just so happened at the end of March that our company got into a strategic planning process. It was actually our quarterly meeting. It gave us an opportunity, which I was really thankful for, to ask ourselves really this question: what is it that we want to focus on in the next 90 days? And so what that did is it helped us focus on the few. In fact, that became our mantra. And it was the first lesson that we really had to learn and be reminded of as it relates to that. In fact, you know, the 17th century philosopher said, it's really, I don't need to be instructed again. I kind of need to be reminded. And so if anything else, this first lesson, as well as the 2 upcoming lessons, are really about being reminded. The second one is what we call relationships matter. This was a really important lesson that I learned. And in fact, if any of you had the opportunity to participate in the roundtable discussion that we had about 30, 45 days ago, right as things were happening, Ryan Turner, a good friend of ours, made this comment of relational equity. And it was a really great comment. And it was really about relationships and what it means. And so I thought a lot about that. And the lesson that I learned is that relationship equity really has an equation. And the equation as a leader for me and for all of us at Handler started with vulnerability and honesty. In other words, let's be honest with what's going on. If we don't know, let's say it. And when you're vulnerable and honest, what it did for us is it built trust. And that trust was really amazing in terms of our ability to build relationships. In fact, relationships that we saw go deeper than we had ever had before. And as a result of that, we were able to make a greater impact in the people that we were around. So these strong relationships helped us with our employee engagement. And it was this idea of being vulnerable and honest, allowing that to build trust, letting that trust develop further and deeper relationships, and then leveraging that to make a greater impact on others. That was the second lesson that we learned. And then finally, the third lesson was this idea of communication. I don't know about you, I actually got my first email. It was on March 6th, and it was from my kid's school. And the title of the email was Our Response to the Coronavirus. And that was my first email. I went back and checked it out. And if I didn't have another 50 or 60, right, that came after that. But what it was is that it was a reminder to me of who am I communicating with and why am I communicating with them? And it brought out this lesson of the people that I was closest to are the ones that I need to make sure that I'm doing a really good job of communicating. So in my world, it was my family, it was my friends, it was me reaching out to people maybe I hadn't talked to in a while. It was my team members. And so communication was definitely a lesson that I learned that was really important. And again, I was reminded that you can't over communicate, especially as it relates to this situation. And in fact, there's case study after case study just over the last 30 to 45 days that companies that took proactive measures built greater trust and were able to actually make faster change. So that was a really important lesson. Now let's go ahead and shift away from these lessons and let's talk about what we're calling really a crisis in motion. And in doing our research and really in listening to the questions, reading the questions that you had, they were around three primary areas. And so I want to go ahead and dig into some of those primary areas, share with you some research and what we've learned. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but we are going to do a follow-up for you with this presentation. And we're going to also provide kind of like a one-page document that's going to give you all the links to all the resources and data in case you'd like to review that any further. But far and away, the number one issue is employee wellness, the health and safety. And this is probably not much of a surprise to you, but frankly, employees want to know that their company has their best interest in mind. And going back and thinking about that airplane picture I showed you earlier, probably something we want to avoid is maybe that company didn't have their employees at heart and mind. They were thinking perhaps about other things. I'm going to share a graph that's going to talk to you about what employees are thinking about right now. In fact, I put a couple of the statistics on here, and that is 64% actually want to wear a mask to work, and 61% want to make sure that social distancing is taking place. So we should be thinking about, hey, what are some other safety concerns? What are other wellness and health issues that we need to be thinking about? And, we've heard about good habits and bad habits that are being formulated during this time. I like to run. And I tell you, it's been the coolest thing. I have seen so many people out running and walking, almost 3 or 4 times more people running and walking over the last 45 days than previous to that. So there's been some really great habits that have been developed. And so as employers, what are we going to do to help our employees continue those great habits? Unfortunately, there have also been some bad habits. And we want to make sure that as an employer that we're mindful of what some of those are and just to come around our employees to support them as things begin to reopen and people begin to re-assimilate back into the workplace. So health, wellness, safety, number one issue, no question about it. The second thing, here's the graph. Let me just go to this graph real quick because I tell you what, I looked at the numbers and there was one thing that got me, and that was, I love to hug, I love to shake hands, I love to connect with people. It's my job to build relationships. 45% of the people don't want handshakes and they don't want hugs. So kind of a bummer for me, but it's a reality check of where we are today. Again, if you can't see the numbers here, we're going to provide this information so that you'll be able to take a look at it. The second roadblock that came up in our research that we thought was worth mentioning was this whole idea around employee motivation. In fact, within the last week, a survey took place that said 66% of employees are just not comfortable yet returning to the workplace. So if they're currently in a work from home situation, two-thirds of them aren't ready to go back to work. And there's lots of different reasons why that's the case. I have a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old. So for the last 45 days, we've been homeschooling. I co-office here with my 10-year-old and our 15-year-olds upstairs. But here's the reality. School's going to end, okay, in just a couple of weeks. But what would normally happen as the summertime rolls around is we would enroll them in summer programs. It's not happening anymore. In fact, most of, if not all of our kids' summer programs have been canceled. So for parents, for families that have kids, this has entered a whole new equation in terms of our ability to get back to work in the workplace, because now our kids are going to be at home and we don't even have a place to send them. The other interesting thing, I was talking to our neighbor the other day who works at the Home Depot headquarters. And in fact, they said that they may not even be back to work by October. And when the governor made their announcement, there was a tremendous amount of information that was shared about Georgia-based companies, all names that you would be familiar with. That's in our research you can take a look at. But overwhelming majority have said that we're going to play a wait and see attitude. Home Depot said that they might not be able to get back to work until October, not because of concerns, but because of social distancing. They only have 6 banks of elevators. They did a time study and they figured that it would take about 3 or 4 hours just to get every employee up to their workspace. So there are a whole host of issues that relate to employee motivation. The other thing that I mentioned, that I'll mention in our research that was very interesting, in more than half the states, people that have been furloughed or are on unemployment are actually making more money on unemployment than they were in their current job. So talk about motivation and getting people back to the workplace. Now, granted, that's probably not going to last forever, but it is absolutely a consideration. And there are some legal aspects to that of which I really can't speak to, but we've got a lot of folks in our network that would be happy to share some information. And we've got a lot of resources, again, that we'll include in that download doc that will provide that kind of information. What we're seeing is that upper management and leaders of organizations are beginning to take the first steps of re-entering the workplace. They're beginning to learn from those experiences, and they're then shaping those experiences as they bring more and more people slowly back to the workforce. The third item that we've seen as it relates to reopening is this idea of a changing workplace. And this is very significant, and it's also very interesting. In fact, it begs the question, what does the future of work look like for us in light of the last 45 days? Is it work from home versus going back to the office? And what are some of the considerations that we need to take in place? There's benefits for employees, but what's also interesting is there's significant benefits for employers. If we just look at what I'll call the Zoom effect, where Zoom's growth went from 10 million daily users to 300 million daily users, the whole idea of doing something like this, where video calls are now commonplace, is impacting the way that employees and employers are thinking about the changing workplace. In fact, the stat says that 54% of people say that they're more productive working from home. But what's interesting is that if you're a leader typically accustomed to managing a workforce that's in the workplace in one central location, it's very different when they're dispersed in the market working from home. It requires a whole new set of leadership capabilities, and trust is something that really has come up. Are my folks doing the work that they need to get done? And how we manage around that is changing. We've talked to commercial real estate executives. This has been super interesting because what they're seeing and what we know to be the case is that a greater than $10,000 a year cost savings with a full-time employee that comes into the office at a 50% capacity, the savings is greater than 10,000. So what does that mean? Does that mean a staggered schedule? For those of us that have been accustomed to working at home during certain periods of our career, we've understand the challenges of work-life balance. But what's interesting is that most of workers are not accustomed to working from home. And they now understand this challenge of work-life balance. In fact, it's been kind of interesting. A word or a day that we celebrate in early February has been something that's been said commonplace, and that's Groundhog Day. And that's because all the days are blurred together, and workers don't understand yet and haven't developed the capabilities as to how to effectively separate their work from their personal life when they're working from home. And I guess the last point that I'll make is there at the very bottom. And this is really interesting to me. And that is the reality that much of what we thought was not to be possible or impossible has been possible. For many organizations who perhaps resisted allowing their workers to work from home have actually seen dramatic productive improvements as a result of that. And so that all of these things that I've just covered, I think are going to play interesting roles in the changing workplace. In fact, the research supports that as we move forward, these are definitely one of the barriers or considerations or what we call roadblocks to reopening. So as we make a transition now to the last portion of our presentation, we're going to start to talk a little bit about the new hiring landscape. And so this is really things that we've been thinking a lot about in light of what's been happening for the last 30 to 45 days. And we've tried to narrow it down, although there's a lot of stuff going on as it relates to hiring. Obviously, a lot of companies have slowed down, they've paused, but what we're focused on is what is going to happen after that. What we've seen directly and what we've known to be the case, but it has been accelerated, is this idea that there are digital competencies that are going to be required at a higher level than what companies currently needed. I'll give you a personal example. We were working on a search here pre-COVID. We started it in, say, February, mid-February, and we began the search with a certain set of parameters. And then COVID hit, we put the position on hold, and we've just recently restarted the search. And what's interesting is that when we restarted the search, the digital competencies that were required went from kind of a nice to have, 5%, if they've got that in their background, that would be great, to 20, 25, 30%, they've got to have it. So digital competencies is something that employers, we believe, are going to require. And in fact, if we just think about what happened to the retail sector when everything closed down, you had so many retailers that were reliant on walk-in traffic. 100% of their revenue was based on walk-in traffic. And then in a day, it shifted dramatically, and they began to pivot, there's that word, pivot, to generate revenue online. We believe that there's going to be a tremendous need for long-term capabilities and competencies in this digital arena to be able to support that. And I'm sure that your organization probably has lots of examples in terms of what this period of time has done to increase the digital capability. There's a stat that I've got that's really quite interesting, and it's that 55% of employers worry about losing their job. Employees worried about losing their job. This was done in 2019. My guess that number is going to jump up to 75 or 80%. So as employers, we want to think about pandemic proofing. The next thing that we're thinking a lot about is what we're calling the time machine effect. And I want to share an example of what I mean. I work right near my general practitioner, my doctor, and I was having a conversation with them just 2 weeks after everything occurred. They literally changed their business to telemedicine, where 80% of their business is now telemedicine. And I thought that that was unbelievable. In fact, you know, doctors have been talking about telemedicine for years, yet it took this pandemic to be able to jump into a time machine and literally advance our business 2 or 3 years within the matter of 2 or 3 weeks. And so as a recruiter and as a company in the recruiting industry, we can't help but think about how this impacts our recruiting process in terms of getting better talent faster. And what does this mean as it relates to the online platforms that we utilize and how we interact with our clients and our candidates. And then finally, the last thing that I'll hit on, which I think is super important, is this idea of leadership and legacy. And, you know, leadership is always a really important item in our business. It's really what we're focusing on, is finding leaders who make an impact. But as employees and as employers, what do we expect from our leaders? And as leaders, what is required of us? And one of the pieces of data that we went to, which I thought was really interesting, is the Edelman Trust Barometer. And some of you may have heard of this data set before, but it's a survey that's been done for many, many years. But the reality is that 76% of people say that CEOs should take the lead, not just in a crisis like COVID, but in general. So whenever there's a situation, folks are looking to the leaders of organizations to take the lead. And in fact, 75% of employees feel that their most trusted relationship is with their employer. So as an employer, we have this incredible responsibility to lead our people and to lead our people well. Because at the end of the day, they're going to look back and they're going to see how they were treated. They're going to see the actions that were taken. And so the big idea and the point that I would love to lead you with as it relates to wrapping up this new hiring landscape is this idea of your leadership absolutely matters. And so as recruiters, listen, we'd be remiss if we didn't at least end with an interview question, right? And so let me ask you this question. What was your company's coronavirus response to protect its employees and ensure the financial viability of your company while demonstrating responsibility to protect the health and well-being of all? And so at some point, we may be asked something like this, or we may be wanting to respond as it relates to our employer brand. And so I want to leave you with that. Your leadership matters. You matter. We so appreciate the opportunity to share this research, to share this data with you. As a follow-up, and as I mentioned before, we will touch base with you to send all of the data, all of the links. In addition to that, we'll provide the quick links and guidelines to organizations that probably all of us, unfortunately, are spending more time with: the EEOC, the Department of Labor, the ADA, OSHA, the CDC now is something we're spending a lot of time with. And so thank you all for participating. We really appreciate you. We appreciate serving you. And you have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye for now.